right, well, it's wonderful to have all y'all here today in person, and then obviously we have some folks joining us virtually as well, which is amazing. Isn't technology wonderful? So I just want to welcome y'all to this panel. The title of this panel is Back to the Future, Aligning Secondary and Post-Secondary Education with Workforce Outcomes. And I think we have a panel of three gentlemen who could not be better qualified to address this question, these big questions facing our state. At this time last year, Texas's economy looked unstoppable. Unemployment was at 3.5%, and labor force participation was at 61.9%. A year later, thanks to COVID-19 and related policy decisions, while our economy has not stopped, it is facing some significant obstacles. Unemployment is at 8.1%, and labor force participation is down to 58.1%. Not all economic sectors have been affected equally, which is a really interesting thing that we need to grapple with, right? So for instance, it's clear that knowledge work sectors that can accommodate working from home are less affected than in-person services. For example, the leisure and hospitality sector lost 15.9% of their jobs compared to this time last year. On the other hand, construction and manufacturing jobs were only down 3.7% overall in Texas. Some metro areas, including Austin and Dallas-Fort Worth, actually added jobs in the construction sector compared to last year, and Austin added jobs in both manufacturing and construction. The theme of this panel, again, is back to the future. So we want to learn from the past to drive us forward into the future. Vocational education, or career and technical education, and the ways we think about it are changing, but it is more important now than ever. The big questions this panel will seek to address are: how do we help currently unemployed and underemployed Texans prepare for good jobs that will actually exist in the post-COVID economy? How do we help Texans on the cusp of adulthood get the skills they need for jobs that are emerging? We are so honored to have with us today three gentlemen who devoted their careers to helping us as Texans address these big questions. Joining me today are, and I'm going to start down here to my left, our Senator Larry Taylor. Before election to the Texas Senate in 2012, he served 5 terms in the Texas House of Representatives. He currently serves as chairman of the Senate Committee on Education and is a member of 3 other Senate committees. He was also a member of the State Budget Conference Committee, a select group of 10 legislators chosen to make budget decisions before the bill is voted on by the entire legislature. During the 86th legislative session, so last session, he sponsored House Bill 3, a comprehensive overhaul of the school finance system. We're going to be talking a lot about that today, I think, and authored Senate Bill 11, an omnibus school safety bill. He formerly owned Truman Taylor Insurance Agency, which merged with Galveston Insurance Associates, and he is a graduate of Baylor University. In the middle here, we are honored to have with us Chairman Brian Daniel. He was appointed by Governor Abbott in July of 2019 as chairman and commissioner representing the public for the Texas Workforce Commission, serving as the representative for the public, promoting and supporting the growth of Texas's employers and workforce. Previously, he served as the executive director of the Office of the Governor for the Economic Development Division, and as vice president for business development at Agricultural Workers Mutual Auto Insurance Company, and as the Texas State Director of Rural Development in President George W. Bush's administration. He is a graduate of Texas Tech University with a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Communications and a Master of Science in Agricultural Education. Finally, right here, I have to my left, Representative Harold Dutton. He is serving his 17th term in the Texas House of Representatives. He previously served as the executive director of the Julia C. Hester House and was president of the 4-Star Broadcasting Company. He's cited as an outstanding young man of America, a member of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, and is a 32nd degree Mason. He's a graduate of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law, where he was inducted into Who's Who in American colleges and universities, and serves as an adjunct professor at the TSU Law School. He has been recognized for legislative accomplishments by organizations including the Ford Times newspaper, the Houston Police Officers Association, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Texas Women's Political Caucus, and more. Please join me in welcoming these eminent guests. So I wanted to kick us off this morning, gentlemen, with a question that I find interesting. I usually ask it when I'm first sort of getting acquainted with folks, and it's, how did you get interested in this in the first place? You've all got expertise and interest in the topic of vocational education and workforce. So I'd like to start with Senator Taylor. If you could tell us a little bit about what drives you, what your passion points are here.
Well, you know, I spent 10 years in the Texas House serving with good people like Dutton, and I never was on the Education Committee at the time I was there. And you know, the way that works in the legislature, you know, we deal with a whole myriad of issues, and you really can't be experts in everything. So you kind of get into your areas and you work in that area. Then you kind of learn people that you trust and you philosophically agree with that are on those committees. You tend to follow those people. And we had a number of good people that I was able to do that in the House. Then when I moved to the Senate, I was put on the Education Committee for the first time. And it was quite an eye-opening experience. Yeah, I've always consider myself somewhat of a fixer. You know, one of my motivations for being involved in politics was, you know, there's issues going on that need to be fixed. Well, you show me a problem, and I want to fix it. And well, we had some real issues that I frankly wasn't aware of. You know, we all think of public education from our own personal experience. And so if you've had a good, positive public school experience with your kids or you personally, you got to think, well, that's what's going on everywhere, but that's not what I learned was happening in the state of Texas. You know, in this great state, we were actually falling behind in a lot of areas. And as a Texan, we don't like saying, hey, yeah, we're number 42. You know, that's not our way. And so I was on the committee, had my eyes opened, and then the chairman of the committee at the time was a guy named Dan Patrick. I'm not sure if y'all have heard of him, but he ended up becoming lieutenant governor, and then he appointed me the chairman, my second term in the Senate. And you know, we just really started doing some deep dives in this. But also, I think it was a positive in that we'd had a lot of people who'd been doing education a long time, who knew some of the same things they've been working on, that kind of thing. So we did things like suggested, let's have a school finance commission to really dig deep in this. You know, people tell, well, we've already done that. We were like, well, I haven't. And we need to look at this. And this, you know, some of this stuff is 40 years old. Yep. And we all know the pace of things change today. It's time to go back and let's take a real look at where we are, what's going on, and what can we do better. And not just throw more money at it, because that's, a lot of times that's been the solution to education. I say solution. We just throw more money and that'll fix it. Well, we know for a fact that doesn't always work. It's how you direct those resources. And so that's really where I got into this. Never thought I'd be doing education, but I really have a passion for it. And you know, to think about the responsibility, Texas, as big a state as it is, with 5.4 million students in public school, that's a lot of pressure. To think we've got to get those kids a good quality education, because where we were headed as a state, you know, when you find out that things like 60% of our student body today qualifies for free reduced lunch, that means they're low income, and historically that's been our least educated. That's already 60%. It's our fastest growing demographic. If we don't reach that demographic as a state, you don't have to look too far down the road. We're upside down. So that's why you saw such a huge effort towards making sure we get the resources and the programs that are proven to work for those students to get them caught up and frankly move up the whole state in our ranking, but make sure we have a workforce for the future, make sure those students have the future that they deserve.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'd love to hear these stories. Chairman Daniel, I'd love to hear your story about what drives you and what brings you into the workforce space, and just more about your background in this.
Well, appreciate it very much. I grew up in a rural community, and our one of our most dynamic teachers was our agriculture teacher, that was vocational education then. It's CTE now. And he worked with me. He's an Air Force veteran, went to teaching after he retired from the Air Force. He just captivated us with all the things that we could do in agriculture and food and fiber and all the things that were happening. And he got me very involved in the FFA. Ultimately, I got a scholarship, which ended me up at Texas Tech University. And I went to school using other people's money because of this interest that I had in agriculture. So I had scholarships that paid for it all. My parents are both teachers, both retired now, but both teachers. And so I had this sense of what education could do. At our house, it was never if you go to college, or if you might go to college, or where you might go to college. It was when you go to college, you need to figure out where that is. Well, they helped me with that with the scholarships. Studied agriculture, stayed and got a master's degree. I thoroughly enjoyed teaching. Ended up in Washington, D.C. as a congressional staffer because of some exchange programs. And then I came back to Texas, appointed state director for rural development. And that's when I really began to understand what was going on in my hometown, why we all had to leave, why our biggest export was cash and kids and not the commodities that we produce there. It's an agricultural community, and it had declined in the 10 years I'd been gone to the point where I was just really concerned about services for the people who were left there, including people I graduated from high school with. And so I started studying why that is. That led me to some private sector jobs, and then ultimately ended up with Governor Abbott as his Director of Economic Development, which put me in corporate boardrooms, talking to CEOs, understanding what companies were doing. And so between this look and now 20-year study of rural development and why rural areas are a little bit exceptional in a lot of ways and some things we can do to help them, I began to really understand why and how employers are putting their workforce together, which is my interest in being at the Workforce Commission. It's fascinating to me. They spend, meaning CEOs, as much time talking about talent as they do almost anything else. And their look for talent, it is really mind-boggling, the lengths they will go to get good talent. And we have to form more partnerships with them. Much of this workforce discussion has to be driven by the employers that are going to hire the workforce. 100% of the jobs in the state are created by employers. That right. Part we can't escape. And if we really try to understand what they want, we can't solve the problems in a vacuum. Right. Yeah, I think some things the legislature is doing currently really move us toward that end. It is the community. It is the schools in that community. It's the employers that are going to employ people from that community that let us keep jobs at home. Rural areas, urban areas that just haven't seen the development that other parts of that county or city have seen. We have to look at those special areas while we understand the way it grows is employers come in and create jobs. And the way they get there is they're looking for talent, resources, and the things that they need to make their company successful. And so, originally in August when I arrived at the Workforce Commission, we were going to work on these things. I have not spent the majority of my career working on these things at the Workforce Commission because we've been focused on some other stuff. But we're there now. We're back to that, and we're understanding how to form these partnerships with the private sector so that you have a true public-private sector partnership so that we can really push forward some of the things the legislature's made possible for schools and others to do, push that forward into the future so we can get that talent so those companies can continue to come here.
That's fantastic. I love that. I've keyed in on a few things there. We'll double click and come back to that word partnership in a little bit, but I'd like to turn it over to Representative Dutton to tell us a little bit about your passion here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. First, let me say thank you for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity. I was thinking about the question when you said that, and I guess the first thing I thought about was I grew up in Northeast Houston, in perhaps what might be considered one of the poorest communities in the state. But one of the things I had as an advantage was I had a dad who I wanted to stand on the corner with all the other guys and hang out, and my dad told me I could do that, but I had to make all A's. And so I didn't understand that, but so I kind of stood there, but I kind of had to make good grades too. As a consequence, when I graduated high school, I was 16. I just turned 16 years old. But my dad was one of these people. My dad had grown up in Louisiana, basically farming and stuff, and then when they moved to Houston, it was because of the sugar mills that all closed down in southern Louisiana. But he always wanted to be an educator. I mean, I think that was his passion, and he transferred it to all his 7 kids. So that when I came to the legislature, one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to get involved in education because the schools in my district and the children and the students in my district needed a lot of things they weren't getting. And so I went to the speaker and I asked to be on public education. And some of my friends who were just also starting, I came in the class with Rick Perry and a whole bunch of Dan O'Reilly and all those people. And they said, Harold, if you get on that committee doesn't have any lobbyists. And so that's not the right, I said, but I'm not getting on there for lobbyists. I'm getting on there for my district. And that's when my passion is, to try to figure out how to make the system of education that we have work for the students and the schools and the campuses, not just in my district, but particularly in my district and all the state of Texas. There are some things we did during the last session which became absolutely monumental in terms of the kind of assistance that it did for students. But we still have a gulf that we haven't crossed in terms of, and I'm fond of saying this, we in Public Education Committee, which I've had the pleasure of serving on longer than anybody in the history of Texas, and I say that with some caution because sometimes that means to people that I must be part of the problem, but I mean, I tell them that we could have seen what could have happened if I wasn't there. But so my dad, plus the one thing I think in terms of my bio you were reading, I spent 18 years with Conoco in the corporate planning section. And so I had the background of having come out of a corporate setting, which benefited me greatly. But it's resulted in me, even in my own children, I have 7 kids myself, just like my dad has. Both my daughters are doctors. My son graduated Phi Beta Kappa at Morehouse, and my next son got his undergraduate degree in engineering at University of Oklahoma, and my next son graduated from Macomb School, MBA here. And then my next son, he graduated from the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music in New York. And so what happened was, because of my dad, and making me do what I should do, caused me to do what I should do for my children. And that motivated me to want to do that for all children. And so that's where I am now. That's my greatest passion. I plan to be on the Public Education Committee in the 87th session because it's my seniority picked. So even if the speaker didn't want me on there, I could get on there anyway. And I still plan to do that because there's so many challenges that we face, particularly in terms of matching up education with workforce opportunities, because everybody in here would recognize there's a direct correlation between education and workforce success. If you don't do the things you should do to get properly educated, then you lessen the opportunities for success in the workplace. And that's just the way it's always been. And so one of my things has been trying to make sure that our education system, delivery system, is one that's responsive, not only in terms of the way we've done it. We've sort of come to the session and we improve education by raising the ceiling. But one of the things I've said is we need to, at some point, raise the floor. There are children who remain at the bottom, and such that when we raise the ceiling, all we did is put success a little bit further away from them because we didn't provide them with the resources. But anyway, that's kind of where I am.
Well, I feel really honored to hear those stories. One of the reasons I selected the theme, the title, Back to the Future, is precisely echoes a lot of what y'all have been saying. My father went through vocational education in the 70s in Florida, and it changed his life.
Right.
It made him decide to become an HVAC repairman, and he found a very fulfilling career in that. And he always lamented, why don't those programs still exist in the way they did? And so he has a sentimental attachment to that, and he passed that along to me. I'd like to go ahead and open up a question for really anybody who wants to take it. It's fairly broad, but I think you already touched on this, Chairman Daniel. But post-COVID, I mean, there are so many immediate challenges, right, in the labor market, right, and how people get their jobs that we need to address as we recover from this. I'd like to hear each of you tell me kind of what you think the most pressing of those immediate demands are. And then, looking past that, looking forward, past this recession that we're in or emerging from, what are some longer term reforms that you think are absolutely necessary to better align our systems, to better align our educational systems, both at the high school and the post-secondary levels, with our labor market demands as we grow and change as a state? Now, I'll just open it up. Anybody can take that.
Well, I think first thing, we had started on a path towards promoting more career tech with House Bill 3. So that's obviously been stalled somewhat with all the COVID consequences there, but we need to make sure we continue pressing into that because that is very important. We kind of made this switch. You talked about where we were for a while. We kind of did fall back on career tech. We kind of got in this mode where everybody's going to go to a 4-year university. Well, that's not accurate, and that's not what we need. I mean, there are plenty of really good careers out there that don't require a 4-year degree, maybe a 2-year or a certification. So we've kind of made that switch, fully engaged in Texas. Now we need to follow through with it, and a big part of doing that is to make sure we continue with the things that we started with House Bill 3. Beyond that, I mean, COVID has been quite an educational experience, and I mean that in positive and negative. We've learned a lot of things in COVID. They're not going away. I mean, you talk about rural, people can live in a rural area and work anywhere in certain types of jobs and careers. We've got to make sure those students have those skill sets, that they have those opportunities to work anywhere from wherever they live. And so these things are changing. I mean, just driving into town every day, I live just out on Mopac, traffic is much reduced. Now, we want our economy back, but I think even when our economy is back to pre-COVID levels, I think you're going to see reduced traffic. And I think that's going to last for a while. I see people clapping, the ones that live here in Austin. But that's going to happen everywhere. And so if you really want to get way out in the future, there's some really unusual things. You have the old typical 4-year university degree, these kind of things. Employers are learning now that they can hire skill sets. And you may not even have to have a 4-year degree or even a 2-year. If you've got the skill set that they're looking for or that they can train you to do, it's going to change a lot of higher ed, the things we've been doing, kind of gearing up. And the facts are, and you all know this, as quickly as things are changing, you can't train someone for the skill set today for the rest of their career. It just doesn't exist that way anymore. Now, there may be some jobs, but it's going to be a smaller and smaller number like that you teach them a skill set, and that's what they're going to use the rest of their career. We're going to have to teach people to continue to learn and be excited about learning and be prepared to take on new challenges and learn new skills, because it's going to be happening on just a revolutionary deal. We don't even know where it's going from here. The jobs are coming today in the future. We don't even know what they are today.
Yeah, I love that. I actually have a question in here that used the word drones, and then you said in the far future, and I was like, should I even bring that up? We'll get there in a second. But I wanted to ask you, that question of lifelong learning.
Was I droning on?
No. I was actually thinking about delivery services and how that affects traffic. But you're exactly right, and I want to actually pitch this over to Chairman Daniel. That question of the lifelong learning piece. You start out with one skill set, but you need to keep training to be ready for the next generation of jobs, right? And so that's where, I think a lot of our friends in higher education may have been kind of stuck in the paradigm of, it's one and done, essentially. How do we help people learn the skills of continuing to learn, and what are you hearing from employers on that end?
Yeah, one of the co-products of COVID has been that a lot of programs that kind of just operate automatically haven't been. And so it's given Harrison Keller and I a lot of opportunities to talk, which is about once a week these days, about different things that are going on. Now to attack your question directly, I think most campuses, certainly community college campuses, and I have in the last 6 months had some very encouraging conversations with leaders at the university campuses, is understanding that it's not so much the particular discipline that a student takes a degree in. It's the ability for employers to understand that students who complete a program at a particular institution have the capacity to continue to learn. Now, if you think about this, in February 2020, We set a record for the most number of Texans employed in Texas at any given time in history. And then a month later, that was not true. And so we've had to learn a lot about how people work and how they engage with the workforce. Now, if we look at now, and then if we look at a short-term future, a middle-term future, and a long-term future, you're going to see, you have been seeing shifts. And we've got 7 months of sustained job growth. And when I'm looking at the employers that are bringing people back into the workplace, it's a constant shift. Here's the thing, it's always been a constant shift. At the entry level, things move rapidly. But the folks who are taking entry-level jobs aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily have any kind of post-secondary education. Moving out of this, we have to look at opportunities there to understand what industry-based credentials might be if industries are hiring a fact set. We need to look at what we can do to increase someone's employability in the very short term. At the same time, we increase access for them to continue to acquire skills as they move forward. If they have a good employer, the employer will make sure that they acquire those skills. If they have an employer who's just not as up on things, or perhaps it's a smaller employer that can't afford that kind of investment in education, we have to look at partnerships between our public schools, whether that's secondary schools or post-secondary schools, and ways to help those employers streamline that ability to continue to get those skills. A problem that Texas faced prior to COVID was, I would characterize it simply as a middle skills gap. We have a lot of entry-level employees. We have a lot of professional-level employees in the state that do very well. In the middle, there were jobs going untaken because we just simply couldn't supply the sheer number of people that employers needed. And so we really have to also, at the same time we're looking at ways to structure this lifelong learning, we have to find ways to quickly move entry-level employees to middle-level skills. And that's also going to require the same kinds of partnerships between employers and any kind of educational institution so that they can come together and do that. I think the net result is that we have to stop sort of looking at disciplines and how we're going to train someone in a single set of skills so that we increase just any individual Texan's opportunity by giving them a set of skills that can get them a job now, but then giving them some sort of pathway to continuing to add to those skills. We all do it. I was 24 years old before I ever had my first email address. And now I don't remember how we did it before that. And I look at all the things that have happened just during my career. If I had stopped learning with what Texas Tech gave me in 1992, I mean, I wouldn't be here. I'd be doing whatever it was I was doing in 1992. But I learned to learn. And so for us in high school, community college, and other ways that we can get skills and education for folks is building in that ability for them to continue to access those skills.
I love that. We're going to keep digging in on this theme. You guys have both brought up some great stuff. I'd like to turn it over to Representative Dutton and just hear what you have to say about this and what your thoughts are on this question of lifelong learning and how people can get equipped. I love what you said about the floor, and I think that first job is so important, but then how do you build on that going forward?
Well, let me agree with both the previous speakers. I think what they've done is particularly highlighted the things related to COVID. But let me come at it from another standpoint. The disparities that existed in education that were there prior to COVID, COVID made more glaring as a result of COVID. And we still have to address that somehow or another. And I think that in terms of addressing it, what it invites is perhaps we can look at different models for delivery of education. That's what it ought to have, because I think the whole thing of having all the children and sort of teaching them a certain way in a little red schoolhouse and having everybody sit there and try to make it work, it somehow or another doesn't match up. Now, one of the things I find, though, which I found curious, is that many of the people who thought about a program in schools for having children take vocational ed, they thought of that as a lesser education program than the standard education. I mean, somehow or another, I don't know where they got that from, that they thought that if you take vocational, if you go down the vocational road, then you're asking for a lesser quality education. And I said, no, that's not what this is about. What this is about is basically enhancing that education, that standard education that you get, so that you'll be capable and qualified to go into the workplace, because that's what's important. And so I find that it interesting that some people thought of it that way, that somehow or another they were advocating to have career stuff at school because they thought that was going to result in a quality of education that might be less than what if you were going to college, for example. Right. And so that's one thing we've got to work on. I think that trying to make sure that we shore up these disparities that now have become, like I said, more glaring. We've got to develop the kinds of programs that help to resolve that.
Yeah, I really want to click in on that. That's something that is becoming kind of interestingly obvious in the post-secondary space right now. There was a report out by the National Student Clearinghouse that said that first-time attenders of college, in other words, people who went directly from high school to college in 2020, was down across the board, something like 21%, but for low-income students, it was down 29%. So we're talking about a generational change here. I don't think that 2020 is going to be the last year we see this decline in the high school to four-year college pipeline, so to speak. I think this might trickle forward based on the information we're seeing about the number of students filling out FAFSAs and other indications. So I do think it points to really needing to rethink what post-secondary looks like, to your point. One of the things I wanted to sort of dive in and talk a little bit more about is House Bill 3 from the 86, which was a monumental achievement. And just talk a little bit about one piece of that, which I think directly addresses kind of some of the themes y'all are talking about today, which is the College Career and Military Readiness Bonus that was included in House Bill 3. And what this bonus does is it rewards schools, basically, for students who, after they graduate, are either able to enroll in a college or enlist in the military, or in some cases get industry-based certifications to indicate that they're ready for their next step. And so this was a really important step forward, I think, in aligning the incentives of the educational institutions with the interests of students and employers. I would like to learn from each of you what you think about that kind of an approach where you align the incentives of educational institutions with those of employers, any improvements you might see in retrospect, or any ways we can expand on that kind of idea. And I'll start with Senator Taylor.
Well, obviously I like it.
Yeah.
It's in the bill. And it's kind of a revolutionary thing for public school funding, if you think about it. Now, we've already kind of, in community college funding, we've had success points, which was actually rewarding community colleges for having students actually succeed in those areas. And Texas State Technical College, we actually had where they were getting paid based on the benefits of what had happened with their students for the whole state's economy. So we were kind of doing that. But in public education, we've always had a big thing about paying for the types of students you have. But what CCMR bonus does is not just pay you for the students you have, but pay you for doing something with those students. And that's really the measure of a good school district. They don't get to pick the students that come to their campuses, but what do you do with those students? And what else at the end of a 12, 13-year public education career should you have other than a student who is college, career, or military ready? And we've just been paying for graduates. And whether they could do anything with it or not. If you go back to the school education reforms that started back in the 90s, we had people graduating who could not read. So we've gone from that, paying for 12 years of public education, graduating students who couldn't read, to now we're going to pay to give you a bonus. And particularly like what Harold refers to in our lower income, we're going to give you more money. If you got a student who is way behind when you got them because their cultural background or social whatever, we're going to give you more money to get that child at the end of their career, college, career, military, to really put the emphasis on where education should be. And so that is a big deal. And I'm promoting that. We may want to refine over time to make sure we're filling the skill sets that employers in that region need. But we had to get that over the hump to start with. But I think that we're there now. Once again, this has been kind of slow with COVID, but we're going to continue to press in on this.
Good.
This is going to revolutionize our public education system in Texas and make sure these students are getting it. And schools always want to talk about funding. Well, here's your funding right here. Get those kids out there. We've also done other things like paying for we're requiring FAFSA. We know the numbers are down, but requiring FAFSA for graduation unless the parents decline. So we want people to see, students to see, you really could go to community college. You really could go get this certification. You've already shown, and having more college type or advanced type work in the high schools, showing them that they can actually do this work, it opens up their minds that, hey, I can do more than just graduate. I can go do this. And moving more education of what's out there in your area. Show them the employment opportunities to younger students starting in 8th grade. Here's what's out there. So you don't just have to imagine this stuff on your own. Here's the really good careers that are already happening in your area. If you'll study these things, you can get those kind of jobs. So I think we've made great strides into that area. We're just going to continue pressing in and make sure that it has good follow-through.
I love to hear that. Yeah, we love that model of the return to value funding model, right, for TSCC, and we're very interested in seeing how that that concept, right, can expand to other educational sectors. And I think the CCMR is a perfect example of that. And I love the idea of institutions having their incentives aligned with those of the students. I think that's such a simple concept for people, but when you stop and think about it, as you pointed out, that's not what they were being rewarded for, is for seat time essentially, right?
Yeah.
As opposed
Just pay
to
for the
outcomes.
And we would pay them more if you had certain kind of students, which we're
Right.
still doing that.
Right.
And we increase funding for
Right.
those students that are most at risk to make sure we got teacher paid to,
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of our lower income school campuses also have our least experienced teachers. So we did things that make a lot of sense, like why don't we get our best teachers on our most challenging campuses rather than allowing this system to continue where you get your 2 or 3 years experience, then you go to an easier school. Well, that's totally upside down.
Yeah.
Let's pay the really good teachers more money to stay where the students are more challenged and get them the education that they need.
I love that. So I want to throw it out to Chairman Daniel and to Representative Dutton as well. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on this concept of better aligning the actual incentives of educational institutions, whether they're high schools or post-secondary, with employers. And we are nearing our Q&A time. So if you could just kind of give me some actionable items you think would help. I'll start with you, Chairman Daniel.
Well, in the interest of time, I'd answer the question this way.
Yeah.
That provision, just career, military, post-secondary readiness for students, put students in a position where the question at graduation is not what am I going to do next, but what of these things will I select for myself. So rather than wondering what is out there in the world, they will have some idea of that, some ability to make a decision. The second thing it will do, whether the community is in Northeast Houston or in rural Texas, that community who doesn't have the resources that other communities have because of their community, their work base, their geography, whatever the situation is, it will really create a situation, in my opinion, where we will stop training children to leave that community in order to find success. It will let us bring a little more economic success back to that community and help us spread that out over the state. Our interstate corridors are doing wonderfully economically, save for a few pockets that we're working on. And we want to see that start to spread out across the state. And I think that really starts to give us an opportunity to do that.
Love that. Representative Dutton.
Well, let me first thank Senator Taylor, and he's not here, but Chairman Huberty. What they did in House Bill 3 was absolutely funding historic, as I call it, because what we did were some things in House Bill 3 that had never been done in Texas, yet we all knew they needed to be done. For example, the thing he mentioned about sending our best teachers to the worst problem we had. That's a concept that I talked to Dan about, because when I grew up in corporate America, we never sent our worst people to our worst problem. We always sent our best people to our worst problem, because if you wanted to get it fixed, that's the only way it was going to happen. And so we started to embody that same concept in House Bill 3, because now we encourage teachers with funding to stay or to go to those schools that need the most help. And it seems to work. The amount of funding that we do for career and readiness in House Bill 3 was absolutely historic again, because now the only question I had about it that still remains somewhat a question is, students had to make this election. And sometimes I think about me as a student, if I had to make an election, I would have probably said, well, what's the easiest one to do? That's what I want to do. And so somehow or another, I think we have to put the career counseling element back in it so that children can be sufficiently guided toward where they ought to be, and rather than leaving it up to them. And in some cases, leaving it up to them and their parents even. Sometimes their parents don't recognize it or can't fully understand the context in which they're trying to decide a career path, whether they want to stay on this path or this path. So anyway, that's the thing I think most about House Bill 3. And if you read the things in it that we developed that changes the whole outcome of education for students, I think you'll be absolutely amazed.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I do think there's so much there that was, again, revolutionary to begin with, and
Right.
so much, as you all pointed out, that can be built upon and grown into the future. And it's the kind of dynamic system that will help Texas to meet the needs of the future, I think. So we're moving into Q&A time, and so I'll just open it up to the audience. Do we have someone with a microphone? Thank you, Robert. Okay, this young lady here. Yes?
Yes, I don't know any of your names because I came in late, but I'd like to address a question to you.
Yes.
When my children were in school, I participated in something called Junior Achievement,
Yes.
where people who had business backgrounds, educations, they had knowledge, came into classrooms and talked to, in my case, I talked to a classroom of fourth graders. And so have you interwoven any of this? Because, we don't have to pay everyone when we have people in our communities more than willing to come out and be part of it, and on a volunteer basis.
Well, let me, I was smiling because when I was working at Conoco, one of the things I got Conoco to do was to create a junior achievement program in my district. We became famous, though, as a junior achievement company because, first of all, when we started the name of it, I was going around the room and asking all the students, and one little kid said, "Huh?" And I said, "Okay, write that on the board." And "Huh" won the name of the company. So every time somebody asked you, "What's the name of your company?" they would go, "Huh?" And what we started doing, though, the government came and shut our company down. And let me tell you what happened. I'd come back from the East Coast, and I don't know if you all remember these, but they had these things they called knockers. It was 2 acrylic balls on the end of a string, and you could do it like this. Well, we started manufacturing those as the company. We were paying at least minimum wage to all our employees. But what we didn't know is we didn't have the right quality control, because after a while, the ball would shatter. And we didn't think about that. And so we stood out in front of this mall selling these things, only to later find out that somebody had actually gotten hurt, and so they came and shut us all down. But the point I guess I'm raising is this, is that those are the kinds of things that help students put education and workforce together. I mean, it makes a connection between workforce and, because a young man, Linda Brown, I mean, her brother, who my good friend here, Richard Johnson, knows, he was in that class. And he went on, because of that, to major in engineering at A&M. And he said he got his start in that junior achievement company. And so I think it works. I think it works, and if we could have junior achievement in all the schools, I think that would be a great idea.
So many people out there just wanting to come in and do something, but we need someone to tell us what to do. I was fortunate to be in a good school district that actually knew what to do
Yes.
incorporated everyone and everything they could
Yeah.
about their
And most of the time, not most of the time, but many of the times, the kids who need it the most get it the least. And so that's where one of the things I've been trying to focus on to make sure that these children who are sometimes, it's not them, it's what we're giving them. And we need to give them something.
boundaries. If
Oh,
you
absolutely.
Here's the boundary, and these are what our kids need to come in and talk to us about your job
Yes.
or his job.
Right. Well, one of the things I'm sponsoring this session, which I've done in prior sessions, was in the first, I think it was the first or second Tuesday in October, sponsor a Legislators in Schools Day, where every legislator will go and go select a school or campus within their district and go and stay all day to teach a class at that school, because I think that ultimately helps bridge some of these things. Because one of the things I realize is that, and Senator Taylor can probably attest to this too, everybody who runs for office has a fix for public education, even though they haven't been to a school in 40 years. But they got an idea about how to fix it, and some of them are good ideas. But I think when we get legislators matched up with educators and schools, we begin to solve some of these problems related to how students are given certain opportunities to succeed in education. And one of the things that I found is that many of the students, many of the campuses that have programs like Junior Achievement happen to be the most successful campuses, even educationally.
And if I could just add, what you're referring to with just junior achievement is actually an example of what's going on, not by government mandate, but our employers are getting much more directly involved with education.
Right.
Whether it's at the community college, they know the employees that they need. And we've had this disconnect for many years where we were putting out, here's our output from higher ed, and here's where the employers were, and there was this huge disconnect.
Right.
And you're finding a lot more, even in the high school. We now have career tech high schools. And the local employers are the ones helping bring the equipment to help train these students and give them some skills. So they're working a lot more together today. And it didn't come by government mandate.
Right.
It became because employers recognize we need people, and here's a good way to get them. Let's start early with these people. And of course, we've got internships program set up now, programs with our, the name escapes me, where it's a 6-year program. You start like in junior high, and you have internships, and at the end of your 6 years, you actually have a job. You don't just have skills, you have skills and a job.
Yeah.
These are kids that are in school, say juniors, that move over to IBM and started.
They spend part of their day doing that
Yes.
P-TECH, our P-TECH
Yeah,
program.
that's what it's called.
It's
Couldn't think of the
beyond
name
just
of it.
regular career tech, it's P-TECH, where they're actually working with employers and have internship opportunities, and these kids are, at the end of their time, actually have a job. So
Right.
We love the idea of internships, work-based learning, apprenticeships. That really does get to y'all's point of seeing it in action, getting to actually learn what the employer expects. The soft skills come that way. They don't come by direct instruction. So we're very much in favor of that. We've got actually a couple of things we're working on this session directly related to this question.
Right.
I'd like to make sure we get a chance to have you ask your question, sir.
Yes, this actually, my question dovetails almost
Okay.
identically with what we were just talking about. Throughout the course of the panel, we were addressing ways that we can solve this problem through our schools and the education system, but there's also ways that this can be done through other ways to learn these skills, unions, public-private partnerships, nonprofits, corporate America, coming up. And I was wondering if some of the panel would talk about some of those opportunities and how those things are working in Texas.
Certainly it works across all of those groups. Some of the best apprenticeship programs for tradespeople we see in this state are run by either a collective of employers or the union that would be involved in that particular trade. And I know I've visited one of the employer-based apprenticeships. They count on this program. Start your senior year of high school, CTE course in high school, 3 years of you get paid a wage on your apprentice, this happen to be electricians, apprentice electrician's license. 3 years after you finish high school, you can move into your journeyman's electrician license. You'll double your salary during that 3 years, and then you have a portable credential that goes anywhere in the state. In fact, it's a license by the state, so all employers recognize that. Certainly at the executive level, we see good internships through P-TECH leading into jobs that put students on an executive track. So we think of sometimes apprenticeships as being directed toward trades, but that's not necessarily true. These are not successful unless the industry who needs that particular employee is completely involved in it. Now, it may be, and people can feel about this however they feel about this, it may be that the state has to direct money to these programs on a short-term basis so that the schools can be prepared to train students to enter and those programs so they can successfully complete. But we have found that once the industry takes it over, the program itself becomes much more self-sustaining, and we're able to really see students transition from their K-12 education into meaningful jobs. If I could step back to electricians for a second, we're talking about going from $13 an hour to $26 an hour in a 3.5 year period if they'll stick with it. And they're getting paid the $13 an hour while they're going to get their training to do that. So there are models like that. You get your car worked on, you go to a mechanic. If you look on the mechanic's workspace where his or her toolbox is, you're going to see an SAE qualification, a Society of Automotive Engineers. The Chevrolet dealer, the Ford dealer, or the independent shop didn't set the standard for that. It was nationally the Society of Automotive Engineers decided what mechanics need. There's great programs for that training as well. Pick your industry. It's likely you'll see one of these programs that is outside of school but related to learning. I think for us, at least my interest is building more linkages so that schools can continue to see these types of programs and see that as a viable alternative to just locking someone in to a program of study that was designed somewhere else a long time ago.
I love that, and I want to make sure we have time for one more question. This gentleman here, and then that will be our final question of the morning. So go right ahead.
Yes, I'd like, and I'll any of them anybody that wants to speak to it, but Representative Dutton mentioned vocational. And my question to you is, how do we move our public school system at the high school level to where they give that vocational option that used to be there, which allowed students by the time they were a sophomore to spend a portion of the time working and a portion of the time getting things that made their life better. In other words, how do you make a budget? How do you live if you do this? We have quit that. And in my opinion, the only way we can stop the high dropout students, which drop out and then you just leave them to their own method of how they're going to go from that point in time. If we have a vocational, how do we get it to where we give those that do not want to go to college drop out because they see no reason in college education courses at high school?
Great. Well, thank you for that. I think that really gets to the heart of it. I'll let y'all take that question, anybody that feels comfortable with it.
Well, I would say overall we've made that change. I mean, there are schools literally building career tech campuses. So that's happening, and that's happening at the local level. We've encouraged and promoted funding to do that. But, you know, like I think you're talking about the VICA program, they work off campus and all that. I will say the one shortage I think we are not doing a good job on, and I just say one, but just finance in general. We're not giving kids good economic background in finance. And I think we'll be trying to promote that, you know, how we can. You know, we work with the State Board of Education on curriculum and things. But we've got to give kids a better idea of finance. The idea of going out and getting $60,000 in college debt and thinking that's not a big deal. You know, people need to understand the economics of that, how that affects your life, and you need to be looking for alternative ways of doing things rather than the old, you know, just jump in and get debt and everything's okay. So we've got to do some well-rounding of just general knowledge type things. But I think those programs are still there. But from our perspective, we have certainly promoted the change over to allowing career tech as a viable option and not a secondary option. which it was for a while.
That's kind of the note I want to end on, and I appreciate that Representative Dutton brought that up, and that you, Senator Taylor, as well. Is the idea here is that the career-ready track is not a second-class option. It is as viable and as respectable, frankly, as the college option. And more students are going to be on that path because of COVID, and then I think cultural changes as well. And so we need to be ready as a state to meet those demands. I think employers are demanding it, and it's the only right thing to do by our students. And so I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your PO.
Thank you.